The train lurched forward with a deafening whistle that masked Helena Rosewood's ragged breathing as she pressed herself against the hard wooden seat. Her wedding dress crumpled beneath a borrowed coat that smelled of tobacco and dust. She had climbed through her bedroom window 3 hours before dawn, leaving behind her father's fury and a man twice her age waiting at the altar. And now the vast Texas landscape rolled past the window like freedom itself spreading endlessly before her. The year was 1873, and El Paso stretched somewhere ahead on the horizon, a town she had chosen at random from a map in her father's study, a place far enough from Philadelphia that her family's reach might not extend, though she knew her father would send men after her the moment he discovered the note she had left on her pillow. The other passengers cast curious glances at the young woman, whose dark auburn hair had begun to escape its pins, whose green eyes carried both terror and determination in equal measure. Helena kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching Pennsylvania give way to Ohio, then westward through states she had only read about in books. She had stolen $200 from the household accounts, money she told herself she had earned through 22 years of obedience and propriety, through piano lessons and embroidery circles, and smiling politely at her father's business associates while they discussed her like a prize mare being led to auction. The man she was supposed to marry, Gerald Whitmore, was 56 years old with thin lips and hands that felt like dead fish when he touched her gloved fingers. He owned 3 textile mills and a shipping company, and her father had negotiated the arrangement over brandy and cigars, never once asking Helena if she wanted to spend her life with a man who looked at her the way a merchant examines inventory. She had said nothing during the engagement dinner, had nodded when expected, had allowed her mother to order the wedding dress from Paris. But 3 nights before the ceremony, Gerald had cornered her in the garden during a party and whispered what he expected from their wedding night in such crude detail that Helena's stomach had turned. And she knew then that she would rather die than let that man touch her. So she ran. The train traveled for days, stopping at stations where Helena bought bread and cheese with trembling hands, always checking over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. She changed trains in St. Louis, then again in Kansas City, always heading west toward territory that felt wild and unknowable. The other passengers changed with each leg of the journey, businessmen giving way to farmers, then to ranchers and prospectors, and women with hard faces who asked no questions. Helena's fine dress became dusty, her hands grew dirty, and she found she did not care about the respectability her mother had drilled into her since childhood. On the 6th day, the train pulled into El Paso station under a sky so blue and vast it made Helena's chest ache. The town sprawled before her in shades of brown and gold, adobe buildings baking under the relentless Texas sun, mountains rising in the distance like ancient guardians. The air hit her like a physical force when she stepped onto the platform, dry and hot and smelling of horses and desert sage. This was nothing like Philadelphia with its neat brick row houses and manicured parks. This was raw and rough and real, and Helena felt something inside her chest crack open with possibility. She had $60 left and no plan beyond disappearing into a place where her father could not find her. The station platform bustled with activity. Men loading cargo onto wagons, women in simple cotton dresses shopping at market stalls, children darting between adults with sun-browned faces. Helena stood with her small trunk at her feet, suddenly aware of how absurdly out of place she looked in her traveling dress with its pearl buttons and lace collar. "You look lost, miss." The voice came from behind her, low and warm with a hint of amusement. Helena turned to find a man watching her, and her breath caught despite herself. He was tall and lean with sun-weathered skin, wearing worn denim trousers and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to reveal forearms corded with muscle. Dark hair fell across his forehead beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes were the color of whiskey in lamplight, sharp and assessing but not unkind. He looked to be perhaps 26 or 27, with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in his own skin. "I am not lost," Helena said, lifting her chin in a way her mother would have approved of. "I have simply arrived." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Arrived from where, if you do not mind my asking? Because you are dressed for a Philadelphia parlor, not a Texas afternoon in July." Helena's eyes narrowed. "How did you know I was from Philadelphia? Lucky guess." He tipped his hat slightly. "Matthew Irving. I work the ranch about 10 miles north of town. I was picking up supplies when I saw you step off that train looking like a china doll someone set down in the wrong place." "I am not a china doll," Helena said sharply, then caught herself. This man was a stranger, possibly dangerous, and she had no business being rude to anyone who might help her navigate this unfamiliar territory. "I apologize. It has been a long journey and I am tired." Matthew studied her for a long moment, those whiskey eyes taking in details she wished she could hide. "You are running from something." It was not a question. Helena felt her face flush hot, and she was not certain if it was from the Texas sun or from being seen so clearly by someone who had known her for less than 5 minutes. "That is none of your concern, Mr. Irving." "Maybe not," he agreed, "but El Paso is not Philadelphia. A woman alone here, especially one who clearly has money based on that dress, is going to attract the wrong kind of attention. Do you have somewhere to stay?" Helena opened her mouth to lie, then closed it again. She was exhausted from days of travel and fear, and this man with his direct gaze and easy stance did not feel threatening. "Not yet. I thought I would find a boarding house." "There are 2 in town," Matthew said. "Mrs. Patterson runs one on Mesa Street that is respectable and clean. Tell her I sent you, and she will give you a fair rate." He hesitated, then added, "And if you need work, the general store is looking for someone to help with bookkeeping. The owner's wife is getting on in years and her eyes are not what they used to be." "Why are you helping me?" Helena asked, suspicious of kindness from strange men after Gerald had taught her to question every gesture. Matthew shrugged, the movement easy and natural. "Because you look like you could use help, and because I remember what it is like to be far from home with no one to tell you which way is up." He touched his hat again, a gesture of farewell. "Good luck to you, Miss Rosewood," Helena said before she could stop herself. "Helena Rosewood, Miss Rosewood." He smiled then, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and Helena felt something flutter low in her stomach that she firmly ignored. "Welcome to Texas." He walked away before she could respond, disappearing into the crowd of people moving through the station. Helena watched him go, this stranger who had shown her more genuine kindness in 5 minutes than Gerald had managed in 6 months of engagement. Then she picked up her trunk, which was heavier than she had anticipated, and began walking in the direction she hoped would lead her to Mesa Street. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a 2-story adobe building with a covered porch and flower boxes filled with hardy desert plants. The proprietress herself was a weathered woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She looked Helena up and down when she appeared at the door, took in the expensive dress and the desperate exhaustion, and quoted a rate that was surprisingly reasonable. "Matthew Irving sent you?" Mrs. Patterson asked as she led Helena up narrow stairs to a small room on the 2nd floor. "He said you ran a respectable establishment," Helena confirmed, setting her trunk down with relief. The room was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street below. "Matthew is a good boy, Mrs. Patterson said, and Helena almost laughed at hearing a grown man described as a boy. "Works hard at the Irving Ranch with his brothers. Their father died 5 years back, and Matthew, being the eldest, took over running the place. They raise horses, mostly, and do some cattle. Honest people, the Irvings." Helena filed this information away, unsure why she cared about Matthew Irving's family history. He mentioned work at the general store, Henderson's, down on San Antonio Street. "Clara Henderson is a sweet woman, but she has been struggling with the accounts. If you have a head for numbers, she will be grateful for the help." Mrs. Patterson moved toward the door, then paused. "I do not ask questions about why young women show up in El Paso looking like they are running from ghosts, Miss Rosewood, but I will say this. Whatever you left behind in Philadelphia, it cannot touch you here unless you let it. Texas has a way of swallowing up the past if you are willing to let it go." She left before Helena could formulate a response. Helena sank onto the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what she had done. She had abandoned her family, her home, everything she had ever known. Her father would be furious, would likely send private investigators or hired men to track her down. Gerald might demand legal action, claiming breach of contract or some other justification for her father's business dealings. She was alone in a strange town with $60 and no experience doing anything practical or useful. But she was not married to Gerald Whitmore. Helena lay back on the bed and allowed herself to smile at the ceiling. She started work at Henderson's general store 3 days later, after spending the intervening time adjusting to the brutal Texas heat and buying more practical clothing that would not mark her as an outsider. Clara Henderson was indeed a kind woman, perhaps 50 years old, with graying blonde hair and a warm smile. Her husband Walter ran the front of the store while Clara managed inventory and accounts in a back room crowded with ledgers and supply orders. "Oh, bless you," Clara said when Helena demonstrated her ability to balance columns of figures quickly and accurately. "I have been making such a mess of these books. My eyes just are not what they used to be, and Walter has no patience for numbers." Helena found herself settling into a routine that was utterly foreign to her previous life. She woke early to help Clara with the accounts before the store opened, spent her afternoons organizing inventory and helping customers, and returned to the boarding house, each evening exhausted in a way that felt earned rather than imposed. The work was honest and hard, and she discovered she was good at it. The numbers made sense, the systematic organization of supplies and orders satisfying something in her mind that piano recitals and embroidery never had. She did not see Matthew Irving again for 2 weeks, and she told herself she was not disappointed by his absence. Then one morning, she was in the back room working on a particularly complicated set of supplier invoices when she heard his voice at the front counter, that low, warm tone asking Walter about fence posts and nails. Her pen stilled on the page, and she listened shamelessly as Matthew made his purchases and exchanged gossip about a rancher to the north who was having trouble with rustlers. "Is Miss Rosewood still working here?" Matthew asked, his voice casual in a way that made Helena's pulse quicken. "She is in the back," Walter said. "Doing miracles with our accounts, that girl. Best thing that happened to this store in years." Helena waited, pen poised over her ledger, but Matthew did not come to the back room. She heard the bell over the door chime as he left, and she told herself the hollow feeling in her chest was relief. 3 days later, he returned. This time, Helena was at the front counter helping a rancher's wife select fabric when Matthew walked in carrying an empty burlap sack. He nodded to Walter, exchanged greetings with the rancher's wife, and then his gaze found Helena. Something flickered in those whiskey eyes, recognition and something warmer, before he turned his attention to the shelves. Helena finished with her customer and found herself drifting toward where Matthew was examining a display of rope. "Mr. Irving," she said, pleased that her voice came out steady, "I wanted to thank you for recommending this position. Mrs. Henderson has been very kind." "I am glad it worked out," Matthew said, turning to face her fully. "You look more settled than you did at the train station, less like you might bolt at any moment." "I was not going to bolt," Helena protested, then remembered how close to panic she had felt that first day. "Well, perhaps I was considering it." "And now?" Matthew asked, his gaze direct and intense in a way that made her feel seen in a manner she had never experienced with the society men in Philadelphia. "Now I am staying," Helena said, and realized as she spoke that it was true. She had been in El Paso less than a month, but already this dusty border town felt more like home than her father's mansion ever had. "Good," Matthew said simply. Then, after a pause that felt weighted with unspoken questions, "There is a dance this Saturday at the community hall." "Nothing fancy, just folks from town and the nearby ranches getting together for music and socializing. Would you be interested in attending?" Helena's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain the careful distance she had established between herself and everyone in this new life. But Matthew's expression held no calculation, no expectation of anything beyond honest interest in her company. "I am not certain I know the dances people do here," she said carefully. "Then I will teach you," Matthew said, and smiled that crinkled eye smile that made Helena's careful defenses falter. "It is not complicated. Mostly you just need to avoid stepping on anyone's toes, and I promise to do the same." Against her better judgment, Helena found herself agreeing. Matthew tipped his hat, paid Walter for his purchases, and left with a promise to collect her at 6 on Saturday evening. Helena returned to her ledgers trying to focus on numbers and invoices, but her mind kept drifting to whiskey eyes and sun-weathered hands, and the way Matthew Irving looked at her like she was something valuable and rare. Saturday arrived with the same relentless heat that characterized every day in El Paso. Helena spent the afternoon helping Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen, partly to earn her keep and partly to distract herself from the nervous energy thrumming under her skin. She had not been to a social gathering since fleeing Philadelphia, had not danced or made small talk or allowed herself to be anything other than a woman hiding from her past. "You are wearing a hole in my floor with your pacing," Mrs. Patterson observed as Helena changed clothes for the third time. "It is just a dance, child, not a public execution." "I know that," Helena said, smoothing down the blue cotton dress she had finally settled on. It was simpler than anything she would have worn to a Philadelphia ball, but it fit well, and the color matched her eyes. "I am simply nervous about meeting so many new people." Mrs. Patterson gave her a knowing look. "Or maybe you are nervous about one person in particular." "Matthew Irving is a good man, Helena, one of the best I know. His father was the same way, honest and hardworking and loyal to the bone." "You could do worse than letting that boy court you." "He is not courting me," Helena protested, her cheeks flushing. "We barely know each other." "That is generally how courting starts," Mrs. Patterson said dryly, "with not knowing each other, then spending time together to change that." Matthew arrived precisely at 6, cleaned up in pressed trousers and a white shirt that made his tanned skin seem darker by contrast. His hair was damp like he had just bathed, and he smelled of soap and something woodsy that Helena could not identify. He helped her into his wagon with a hand that was calloused but gentle, and they rode toward the community hall as the brutal afternoon heat began to soften into evening. "I should warn you," Matthew said as they rode. "People are going to be curious about you. El Paso is not a large town, and a beautiful woman from Philadelphia working at the general store is the kind of thing that generates talk." Helena felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. "What kind of talk?" "Nothing malicious," Matthew assured her quickly. "Just speculation. Some folks think you are a widow running from bad memories. Others think you are an heiress escaping family troubles. Mrs. Patterson has apparently been telling everyone you are her niece from back east, which is not true, but seems to have satisfied most of the gossips." "And what do you think?" Helena asked, studying his profile in the golden evening light. Matthew was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a curve in the road. "I think you left behind something that was hurting you, and you were brave enough to build a new life somewhere you had no guarantees of success. I think that takes more courage than most people possess." Something in Helena's chest cracked a little wider at his words, at the simple acceptance they offered. "I was supposed to marry a man I despised," she heard herself say, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "My father arranged it for business reasons, and I was expected to smile and obey and spend the rest of my life with someone who saw me as property. So I ran the morning of the wedding, and I do not regret it even though I know my father will never forgive me." "Then your father is a fool," Matthew said quietly. "And the man you were supposed to marry is even more of one." They reached the community hall, a large wooden building lit from within by dozens of lanterns. Music spilled out into the evening air, fiddles and guitars creating a lively melody that bore no resemblance to the formal waltzes Helena had learned in Philadelphia. Wagons and horses crowded the area outside, and people streamed in and out, their voices raised in laughter and greeting. Matthew helped Helena down from the wagon, his hands steady at her waist. "If it gets to be too much, just tell me and we will leave," he said, his face serious. "I do not want you to feel uncomfortable." But Helena found she was not uncomfortable. The people inside the hall were ranchers and shopkeepers, farmers and craftsmen, women in simple dresses and men in their best shirts. They welcomed her with friendly curiosity, asked questions about Philadelphia that were interested rather than prying, and accepted her vague explanations about wanting a change of scenery. Matthew stayed close but not suffocatingly so, introducing her to his two younger brothers, Aaron and Thomas, who were 24 and 21 respectively, and had the same easy confidence as their eldest brother. "So you are the woman who has Matthew riding into town twice as often as usual," Aaron said with a teasing grin that made Matthew scowl. "I am just ensuring Miss Rosewood is settling in well," Matthew said stiffly. "Is that what we are calling it?" Thomas added, earning himself an elbow to the ribs from his brother. Helena found herself laughing, charmed by the obvious affection between the three men. She had no siblings herself, had grown up in a quiet house where laughter was discouraged and displays of emotion were considered vulgar. This easy warmth, this unguarded joy, was intoxicating. When the musicians struck up a new song, Matthew offered his hand. "May I have this dance?" Helena took his hand and let him lead her onto the floor crowded with other couples. The dance was nothing like the formal waltzes she knew, all quick steps and spins that left her breathless and laughing. Matthew was a good dancer, moving with the same easy grace he brought to everything else, his hand firm at her waist as he guided her through the steps. Other couples bumped into them, apologized through laughter, spun away again. The whole thing felt chaotic and joyful and utterly unlike the rigid social dances Helena had endured in Philadelphia. "You are smiling," Matthew observed, pulling her closer to avoid a collision with an enthusiastic older couple. "I am having fun," Helena said, surprised to realize it was true. I had forgotten what that felt like. Something in Matthew's expression shifted, became more serious despite the cheerful music surrounding them. "The man you were supposed to marry, did he hurt you?" Helena considered how to answer that. Gerald had never struck her, had never done anything that society would recognize as abuse. But his words in the garden had violated something inside her, had made her feel dirty and trapped and desperate. Not physically, but yes, he hurt me. Matthew's jaw tightened. "If he comes looking for you here, he will regret it." "You barely know me," Helena said, confused by the fierce protectiveness in his voice. "Why would you defend me against someone you have never met?" "Because you deserve defending," Matthew said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And because I like you, Helena Rosewood. I liked you from the moment you stepped off that train looking terrified and brave at the same time. I like the way you refused to admit you were lost, and the way you work so hard at Henderson's, and the way you laugh when you let yourself stop worrying about what people might think. So yes, I barely know you, but I would like to change that." Helena's breath caught in her throat. She had been courted before, had received flowery compliments from men at Philadelphia parties who praised her beauty or her accomplishments in ways that felt hollow and rehearsed. But Matthew's words had the weight of truth, of someone who saw her as a complete person rather than an ornament or a business arrangement. "I would like that too," she said softly. They danced 3 more songs before taking a break to get punch that was too sweet and warm from sitting in the Texas heat. Other people claimed Matthew's attention, asking questions about horse trading or fence repairs, matters of ranch business that Helena did not understand but found herself interested in nonetheless. She watched him interact with his community, saw the respect people afforded him, the way they trusted his judgment and valued his opinion. This was a man who had earned his place through hard work and integrity, not through inherited wealth or business connections. As the evening wore on, Helena found herself relaxing in a way she had not allowed since arriving in El Paso. She danced with Aaron and Thomas, who teased her gently and asked surprisingly perceptive questions about her work at the general store. She talked with the wives of local ranchers, learned about the challenges of raising children in territory that was still rough and unsettled. She heard stories about Apache conflicts and Mexican border disputes, about droughts and floods and fortunes won and lost. It was nearly midnight when Matthew drove her back to the boarding house, the wagon rolling through streets lit by moonlight and the occasional lantern. Helena felt pleasantly exhausted, her feet aching from dancing and her face sore from smiling. "Thank you for inviting me," she said as they approached Mrs. Patterson's house. "I had a wonderful time." "I am glad," Matthew said, pulling the horses to a stop. He climbed down and came around to help her from the wagon, his hands gentle at her waist. But instead of stepping back immediately, he stood close, looking down at her in the moonlight. "Helena, I want to be honest with you about something." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "All right." "I am not good with fancy words," Matthew said slowly. "I work with horses and cattle and land, and I do not know how to talk pretty or make elaborate speeches. But I know what I feel, and I feel something for you that I have not felt before. I am not expecting anything from you, especially since you are still healing from whatever brought you here. But I wanted you to know that my interest is not casual. When I spend time with you, it is because I am hoping to build something real." Helena stared up at him, this honest man who offered her something precious without demanding anything in return. In Philadelphia, courtship had been a calculated dance of social maneuvering and family expectations. But Matthew was offering her choice, offering her time, offering her the chance to decide for herself what she wanted. "I feel something too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And it terrifies me because I do not trust my own judgment anymore. I thought I knew what was right when I agreed to that engagement, thought I was doing my duty and being a good daughter, but it almost destroyed me. So I need time to figure out who I am separate from what other people expect me to be." "Take all the time you need," Matthew said. "I am not going anywhere." He walked her to the front door, tipped his hat in that gesture she had come to recognize as uniquely his, and waited until she was safely inside before climbing back into his wagon. Helena watched from the window as he drove away, her hand pressed against her chest where her heart beat a rhythm that felt like hope. The summer rolled on, brutal and bright and full of hard work. Helena's hands grew calloused from handling inventory boxes, her skin tanned despite her best efforts to wear a bonnet, and she learned to navigate El Paso's streets with confidence. She sent no word to her family, made no attempt to contact her old life, and gradually the fear of pursuit began to fade. Mrs. Patterson received newspapers from the East, and Helena searched them anxiously for news of missing heiresses or runaway brides, but found nothing. Perhaps her father was too humiliated to make her disappearance public, or perhaps he had simply written her off as a bad investment. Matthew became a regular fixture in her life, riding into town several times a week on ranch business that seemed to conveniently coincide with her work schedule. He would stop by the general store to purchase supplies, then linger to talk with Helena about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up on the ranch, about the challenges of managing land and livestock in a climate that could be unforgiving. She told him about Philadelphia, about the life of rigid social expectations and constrained choices that had shaped her into someone she no longer recognized. They went on walks through El Paso streets in the cooler evenings, attended church services on Sunday mornings, shared meals at the boarding house where Mrs. Patterson watched them with obvious approval. Matthew never pushed for more than Helena was ready to give, never pressed her for intimacy or demanded declarations of feeling. He simply showed up, reliable and steady, proving through his actions that she could trust him. In late August, trouble arrived in the form of two men who stepped off the train wearing expensive suits and hard expressions. Helena was working at the general store when Walter came into the back room, his face concerned. "There are men asking about you at the hotel," he said quietly. Describing a young woman from Philadelphia who might be working in town. "I did not tell them anything, but I thought you should know." Helena felt ice flood her veins. Her father had found her. She had been foolish to think he would simply let her go, foolish to believe she could disappear without consequence. "What do they look like?" Walter described them, professional men who looked like they had money and authority. Private investigators, Helena guessed, hired to track her down and drag her back to face whatever consequences her father and Gerald had arranged. Her hands shook as she tried to focus on the ledger in front of her, numbers blurring into meaningless symbols. "I need to leave," she said, standing abruptly. "I need to go somewhere they will not find me." "You need Matthew," Clara Henderson said firmly, appearing in the doorway. She had been listening from the front room. "That boy has more sense in his little finger than both of us combined when it comes to this kind of trouble. Walter, ride out to the Irving Ranch and fetch him. Tell him it is urgent." Helena wanted to protest that she could handle this herself, that she had no right to drag Matthew into her problems. But fear overrode pride, and she nodded mutely. Walter left immediately, and Clara made Helena sit down and drink water while they waited, talking calmly about inventory and accounts like the world was not falling apart. Matthew arrived within 2 hours, riding hard enough that his horse was lathered with sweat. He came directly to the back room where Helena sat trying not to fall apart, and his presence alone made her feel marginally safer. "Tell me what happened," he said, kneeling in front of her chair so they were eye level. Helena explained about the men at the hotel, about her certainty that her father had sent them to bring her back. "I knew this might happen," she said, her voice shaking. "I knew he would not let me just disappear. He has too much pride and too much invested in that marriage arrangement." "Did you sign any legal documents committing you to this marriage?" Matthew asked, his voice calm and practical. "No. It was all verbal agreements between my father and Gerald. But my father has influence and money, and he will use both to force me to return." Matthew was quiet for a moment, his mind clearly working through options. Then he stood and pulled Helena to her feet, his hands warm and steady on her shoulders. "I have an idea, but it is extreme and you will need to trust me." "What kind of idea?" Helena asked warily. "Marry me," Matthew said, and Helena's world tilted sideways. Not some distant maybe, not a long engagement that gives those men time to interfere. "Marry me today, right now, and let them try to drag back a married woman whose husband has legal claim to her. Let them try to tell a Texas rancher that he does not have the right to protect his own wife." Helena stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "You want to marry me? Today?" "I want to marry you eventually," Matthew corrected, his whiskey eyes intense on hers. "I was planning to court you properly for at least another 6 months before asking. But circumstances have changed, and this is the best way I can think of to keep you safe. Texas law will recognize our marriage, and it will complicate things enough that those men will have to go back to Philadelphia and explain to your father that his daughter is legally wed to someone else." "But you would be trapped with me," Helena protested. "You barely know me, and I would be forcing you into a marriage you did not plan or want." "Helena," Matthew said, and something in his voice made her breath catch. "I have wanted to marry you since you stood on that train platform and lifted your chin like you were daring the whole world to tell you that you did not belong here. I have wanted it through every conversation, every dance, every moment I have spent learning who you are beneath the fear and the hurt. So I am not trapped. I am choosing this. I am choosing you. The only question is whether you trust me enough to choose me back." Helena's mind raced through possibilities and consequences. She barely knew this man, had only spent a few months in his company. Marriage to him would be binding and permanent, would tie her to Texas and ranch life, and a future she could not predict. It would mean giving up any possibility of reconciliation with her family, of ever returning to the life she had known. But that life had nearly destroyed her. That life had taught her that marriage was a business arrangement and love was a weakness to be exploited. Matthew was offering her something entirely different, something that felt terrifyingly precious. He was offering her choice. "I choose you," Helena whispered, and watched Matthew's face transform with relief and something deeper, something that looked like joy. "I choose love this time." Matthew pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. Helena pressed her face against his chest and breathed in the scent of leather and horses and safety. She was still terrified, still uncertain about what the future would bring. But for the first time since climbing out her window in Philadelphia, she felt like she was moving towards something rather than running away. They were married 2 hours later by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through El Paso. Clara and Walter Henderson stood as witnesses, along with Mrs. Patterson, who produced a simple gold ring she claimed had belonged to her late husband. The ceremony took place in the preacher's hotel room because there was no time to arrange anything more formal, and Helena wore the same blue cotton dress She had worn to the dance where Matthew first held her hand. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Matthew kissed her carefully, like she was something precious that might break if handled roughly. Helena kissed him back, tasting salt from tears she had not realized she was crying. This was nothing like the elaborate society wedding her mother had planned. No expensive dress or cathedral or reception with 300 guests. But it was real in a way that other wedding never could have been, born from choice rather than obligation. They walked together to the hotel where the investigators were staying, Helena's hand clasped tightly in Matthew's. The men were in the lobby, and they stood when Helena entered, recognition flashing across their faces. "Miss Rosewood," the taller one said, stepping forward. "Your father sent us to escort you home. There has been considerable concern about your well-being." "My name is Mrs. Irving now," Helena said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I was married this afternoon to Matthew Irving, and I have no intention of returning to Philadelphia." The investigators looked between Helena and Matthew, clearly trying to assess whether this was some kind of ploy. "Miss Rosewood, if you have been coerced or threatened in any way," the second man began. "I have not been coerced," Helena interrupted. "I left Philadelphia of my own free will because I refused to marry Gerald Whitmore. I came to Texas and built a life here, and I married Mr. Irving because I love him and because I choose to make my home with him. You may report that information to my father, along with the fact that I am happy and safe and have no intention of ever returning." "Your father will not accept this," the taller investigator said grimly. "He has considerable resources and influence." "Then let him waste them," Matthew said, his voice carrying an edge Helena had never heard before. "My wife has made her position clear. I suggest you gentlemen catch the next train back east and tell Mr. Rosewood that his daughter is no longer his to control." The investigators left the next morning, their mission failed and their expression sour. Helena watched the train pull away from the station, carrying with it the last connection to her old life. She felt Matthew's hand settle on her shoulder, warm and reassuring, and she leaned back against his solid presence. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now we go home," Matthew said. "To the ranch, to the life we are going to build together. It will not be easy and there will be challenges I cannot predict, but we will face them as partners, as equals. That is what marriage should be." The Irving Ranch stretched across several hundred acres of Texas prairie, with mountains visible in the distance and sky that seemed to go on forever. The main house was a sturdy adobe structure with thick walls to keep out the heat, and a covered porch that provided shade. It was rustic and practical, nothing like the Philadelphia mansion Helena had grown up in, and she loved it immediately. Matthew's brothers greeted her with genuine warmth, teasing their older brother about his sudden marriage while making Helena feel welcome. They had moved into the bunkhouse to give Matthew and Helena privacy in the main house, a gesture Helena appreciated more than she could express. The house needed work, years of bachelor living having left it sparse and utilitarian, but Helena found herself energized by the prospect of making it into a proper home. The first weeks of marriage were an adjustment. Helena had never cooked on a wood stove or washed clothes by hand or dealt with the dozens of practical tasks that ranch life required. She burned dinner, ruined a load of laundry, and felt utterly incompetent at the most basic domestic skills. But Matthew never criticized or complained, simply helped her learn and laughed with her over her mistakes. His brothers pitched in with advice and stories of their own domestic disasters, making Helena feel less alone in her ignorance. Slowly, she began to find her rhythm. She learned to manage the kitchen, to preserve vegetables and cure meat, to bake bread that did not resemble rocks. She helped with ranch bookkeeping, her Philadelphia education finally proving useful as she organized accounts and tracked expenses with the same skill she had brought to Henderson's general store. She learned to ride a horse, awkwardly at first but with growing confidence, until she could accompany Matthew on some of his shorter trips around the property. And she learned about her husband. Matthew woke before dawn every morning to tend the horses, moving through his chores with quiet efficiency. He was patient with animals and firm but fair with the men he occasionally hired for roundup or branding. He read books in the evenings, surprising Helena with his knowledge of literature and history. He had a dry sense of humor that emerged at unexpected moments, and he sang sometimes while working, his voice rough but pleasant. But he never pushed Helena for intimacy beyond the careful kisses they had shared since the wedding. He slept on the floor of their bedroom for the first 2 weeks, insisting that Helena should have the bed until she felt comfortable sharing it. When she finally told him to stop being ridiculous and climb into the bed beside her, he held her gently and asked for nothing more, content to simply have her close. "Why are you so patient with me?" Helena asked one night as they lay in darkness, Matthew's arm a warm weight across her waist. "You married me to protect me, but this is your home and your life. You have every right to expect a real marriage." "This is a real marriage," Matthew said quietly. "But I know that man in Philadelphia made you afraid of what marriage means, and I will not add to that fear by demanding something you are not ready to give. When you want more from me, you will tell me. Until then, I am content to hold you and know that you feel safe in my arms." Helena rolled over to face him in the darkness, her hand finding his jaw rough with evening stubble. "What if I told you I want more now?" She felt him go still, his breathing shallow. "Do you?" "Yes," Helena whispered, and kissed him with all the emotion she had been holding back since the moment he knelt in front of her at the general store and offered her a way out. Matthew kissed her back with restrained intensity, his hands careful on her waist as if he was still afraid of frightening her. But Helena was not frightened anymore, not of this man who had shown her through every action what love could be when it was freely given rather than demanded. Their wedding night came 6 weeks late, but it was perfect in its tenderness and patience. Matthew loved her slowly and carefully, stopping whenever she tensed to ask if she was all right, if she wanted to continue, if she needed anything. Helena had been told by her mother that marital relations were a duty to be endured, a price women paid for security and respectability. But with Matthew, it was nothing like that. Nothing but pleasure and connection, and the overwhelming sense of being cherished. Afterwards, she lay in his arms and cried, not from sadness but from relief. "I was so afraid," she whispered against his chest, "afraid that I would never be able to let anyone touch me without feeling sick and trapped." "You are not trapped," Matthew said, his hand stroking her hair. "Not with me, not ever. You are free, Helena. Free to choose me every day or free to walk away if you decide this is not what you want." "I choose you," Helena said, the same words she had spoken in that moment of crisis that had brought them together. "Every day for the rest of my life, I choose you." Autumn arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the hard work of preparing for winter. Helena worked alongside Matthew and his brothers, learning the rhythms of ranch life and the endless cycle of chores that kept the operation running. She discovered she had a talent for training horses, her patience and gentle approach earning trust from even the most skittish animals. Matthew watched her work with obvious pride, and gradually she stopped seeing herself as the Philadelphia heiress who had failed at domesticity, and started seeing herself as a rancher's wife who was building something meaningful. In November, A letter arrived from Philadelphia. Helena recognized her mother's handwriting and felt her stomach drop with dread. She carried the letter to the porch and sat in the afternoon sun, turning the envelope over in her hands without opening it. Matthew found her there an hour later, still staring at the unopened letter. "Do you want me to read it?" he asked, settling beside her on the porch steps. Helena shook her head. "I need to do this myself." She opened the letter carefully, smoothing the expensive paper covered in her mother's elegant script. The contents were brief and coldly formal. Her father had disowned her, struck her from his will, and forbidden the family from having any contact with her. Gerald Whitmore had sued for breach of contract, but the case had been quietly settled out of court to avoid scandal. Her mother wanted Helena to know that she had brought shame upon the family and that her selfish actions had consequences for everyone. The letter ended with a single line that cut deeper than all the rest. "I hope your cowboy was worth destroying your family." Helena read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and tucked it into her pocket. She expected to feel devastated, destroyed by this final severing of ties to the people who had raised her. But instead she felt oddly free, like a weight she had been carrying had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "He was worth it," she said aloud, and Matthew looked at her with concern. "What?" Helena pulled out the letter and handed it to him. "My mother asked if you were worth destroying my family, and you were. You absolutely were." Matthew read the letter, his expression darkening with anger. "They disowned you, their own daughter, because you refused to be sold off like livestock, apparently so." Helena leaned against his shoulder, feeling his warmth seep into her. "I thought it would hurt more. I thought I would feel grief or regret. But mostly I just feel relieved. That life, those people, they never saw me as anything more than a commodity to be traded for business advantage. You see me as a person, as someone with thoughts and feelings and dreams. So yes, Matthew Irving, you were worth it. You were worth everything." Matthew wrapped his arm around her and held her close as the sun set over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. Helena watched the light change and thought about how far she had traveled, not just in miles but in understanding of what her life could be. She had been so certain that her path was set, that duty and obedience were the highest virtues a woman could aspire to. But running away had taught her that there were more important things than respectability, and Matthew had shown her what love looked like when it was built on honesty and choice. Winter came to the ranch with cold winds and occasional snow that looked strange against the desert landscape. Helena spent her days helping with indoor chores, mending clothes and preserving food and managing the household accounts. She continued working on her riding, and Matthew taught her to shoot, patiently correcting her aim until she could reliably hit a target at 20 paces. He said every woman on a ranch should know how to protect herself, and Helena found she enjoyed the sense of competence that came with learning new skills. On Christmas morning, Matthew gave her a gift wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "I thought you might want to write down your thoughts," he said, looking oddly nervous, "about this new life you are building. So someday when you are old, you can look back and remember what it felt like to be brave enough to choose your own path." Helena felt tears sting her eyes as she ran her fingers over the smooth leather. It was a thoughtful gift, personal and meaningful in a way that jewelry or fancy dresses never had been. "Thank you," she whispered, and kissed him with all the love she had learned to express in the months since their rushed wedding. She gave him a new saddle that she had commissioned from the leather worker in town, earning money for it by taking on extra bookkeeping work from other ranchers. Matthew's current saddle was worn nearly through in places, and she had noticed him examining new ones in the general store with the careful consideration of someone who could not afford to make unnecessary purchases. When he saw the gift, his face went still with emotion. "Helena, this is too expensive," he said, running his hand over the tooled leather. "You should not have spent your money on me." "It is our money," Helena corrected, "and you needed a new saddle. Besides, I wanted to give you something that showed I understand what your work means to you, that I respect what you do even if I am still learning how to be helpful." Matthew pulled her into his arms and held her tight enough that she squeaked in protest. "You are helpful," he said fiercely. "You are more than helpful. You are my partner in every sense of the word, and I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person." They were words he had said before, but hearing them always made Helena's chest feel too full, like her heart was expanding beyond what her ribs could contain. "I love you too," she said against his shoulder. "Even though I did not plan to, even though I came here running from the very idea of marriage. I love you, Matthew Irving, and I am so grateful I stepped off that train in El Paso." Spring arrived with wildflowers covering the prairie in waves of color. Helena discovered she was pregnant in April, the morning sickness and exhaustion unmistakable signs that her body was changing. Matthew was thrilled and terrified in equal measure, hovering protectively and driving Helena to distraction with his constant concern. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she finally told him after he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time, and I am healthy and strong. You need to trust that I know my own limits." "I just want to keep you safe," Matthew said, looking so earnestly worried that Helena's exasperation melted into affection. "I am safe," she assured him. "The baby is safe, and I promise to tell you if I need help or if something feels wrong, but you have to let me continue living my life." The pregnancy progressed normally, and Helena adjusted to the changes in her body with the same practicality she had brought to learning ranch life. She continued most of her usual chores through the summer, slowing down as her belly grew but refusing to be treated like an invalid. Matthew's brothers were delighted at the prospect of becoming uncles, already arguing about who would teach the baby to ride and rope. In early October, as the brutal summer heat finally began to break, Helena went into labor. Matthew sent Aaron racing to town to fetch the midwife, while Thomas stayed at the ranch house, pacing nervously and jumping at every sound from the bedroom. Matthew held Helena's hand through the contractions, his face pale but his presence steady, and when she gripped his fingers hard enough to bruise, he never once complained. Their son was born just after midnight, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at being thrust into the world. Matthew cut the cord with shaking hands, and when the midwife placed the baby in Helena's arms, she looked down at the red-faced, squalling infant and felt love crash over her like a wave. This was her child, hers and Matthew's, born from the choice she had made to run toward love instead of accepting the life her father had planned. "He is perfect," Matthew whispered, his finger touching their son's tiny hand. "Helena, he is absolutely perfect." They named him James, after Matthew's father, with the middle name of Rosewood to honor Helena's decision to leave behind one family and build another. Jamie, as they quickly began calling him, was a healthy baby with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. He kept them awake at all hours, demanded constant attention, and Helena had never been so exhausted or so happy in her entire life. Aaron and Thomas were devoted uncles, taking turns walking Jamie around the ranch and telling him stories about horses and cattle that he was far too young to understand. Mrs. Patterson came out from town to help for the first few weeks, showing Helena how to nurse and change and soothe a fussy infant. Clara Henderson sent over meals and baby clothes, and other ranchers' wives stopped by with gifts and advice. Helena marveled at the community that had embraced her, this collection of hardy people who accepted her despite her strange background and sudden appearance. They had welcomed her when she was a runaway bride with nothing but fear and determination, and now they celebrated her joy like it was their own. This was what family could be, she realized. Not blood ties and business arrangements, but chosen connections built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Jamie's first year passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small milestones. He smiled at 6 weeks, laughed at 3 months, and took his first stumbling steps the day before his first birthday. Helena documented everything in the journal Matthew had given her, filling pages with observations about ranch life and motherhood, and the overwhelming love she felt for her husband and son. Matthew had been right that day in the general store when he said life would not be easy. The ranch faced challenges, years when cattle prices dropped or drought threatened their water supply. There were difficult births among the horses, conflicts with neighboring ranchers, and the constant physical demands of working land that could be harsh and unforgiving. But they faced each challenge together, partners in every sense, and Helena discovered she was far stronger than she had ever been allowed to be in Philadelphia. On their second anniversary, Matthew took her on a picnic to a spot on the ranch where a small stream ran through cottonwood trees, creating a pocket of green in the golden prairie. They spread a blanket in the shade while Jamie napped in a basket between them, and Matthew pulled out a small box from his pocket. "I never gave you a proper engagement ring," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small emerald. "This is not much, but the stone matches your eyes, and I wanted you to have something that marked you as mine." Helena took the ring with trembling fingers, the emerald catching the light filtering through the cottonwood leaves. "It is perfect," she said, slipping it onto her finger beside the plain wedding band Mrs. Patterson had lent them 2 years before. "Everything about this life is perfect, Matthew. I wake up every morning grateful that I was brave enough to run, and that you were there to catch me when I landed." "I am the one who is grateful," Matthew said, pulling her against his chest. "You could have chosen any town to disappear into, any train that would carry you away from your old life. But you chose El Paso, and you gave me the gift of knowing you, of building this life together, of Jamie." He looked down at their sleeping son, his expression full of wonder. "Sometimes I cannot believe this is real, that I get to have you and him and this ranch, that I got to be the one you said yes to." Helena thought about that moment in the back room of the general store, when Matthew had knelt before her and offered marriage as a solution to an impossible problem. She had said yes out of desperation and trust, but what she had gained was so much more than safety. She had gained partnership and passion, had learned what it meant to be seen and valued for who she was rather than what she represented. She had gained a home in the truest sense, not a building but a person, someone she could return to at the end of each day knowing she was cherished. "I would choose you again," she said softly. "Every time, in every circumstance, I would choose you. You told me to choose love that time, and it was the best decision I ever made." Matthew kissed her gently, tasting of summer sun and promise. Jamie stirred in his basket and made a small sound of protest at being awakened, and Helena laughed as she picked him up. He settled against her shoulder, his small hand fisting in her hair, and she breathed in his baby scent while Matthew's arm came around both of them. This was her family, she thought. Not the cold mansion in Philadelphia with its rigid rules and calculated arrangements, but this man and this child in this wild Texas land. She had run from one life and crashed headlong into another, and she would not change a single moment of the journey. Over the next several years, the ranch prospered. Matthew's reputation as a horse trainer spread, and buyers came from as far as New Mexico and Colorado to purchase Irving horses. Helena took over more of the business management, her skill with numbers and negotiations proving invaluable. They hired additional hands, built a larger barn, and expanded their grazing land. Aaron married a schoolteacher from town, and Thomas took up with the daughter of a neighboring rancher, bringing new energy and laughter to the property. Jamie grew into a fearless little boy who followed his father everywhere, begging to help with chores he was still too small to manage. Helena watched her son with a mixture of pride and terror, seeing Matthew's confidence and stubbornness reflected in their child. He was bright and curious, asking endless questions about everything he saw, and she loved him with a fierceness that sometimes scared her with its intensity. When Jamie was 4, Helena became pregnant again. This time the morning sickness was worse, lasting well into the afternoon and leaving her exhausted. Matthew fussed over her constantly despite her protests, and Jamie tried to help by bringing her water and patting her hand with his small fingers. "It is okay, Mama," he would say seriously. "The baby will come out, and then you will feel better." Their daughter was born in March of 1879, arriving quickly and easily after a labor that lasted only a few hours. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's features, and they named her Grace after Helena's grandmother, the only family member from Philadelphia that Helena remembered with genuine affection. Grace was a calmer baby than Jamie had been, content to be held and rocked, watching the world with solemn eyes that seemed to take in everything. Jamie was enchanted with his little sister, constantly wanting to hold her and show her his toys. Helena's heart swelled watching her children together, this tangible proof that she had built something good and lasting from the ashes of her old life. She thought sometimes about the child she might have had if she had married Gerald Whitmore, a baby born from duty rather than love, raised in a household where affection was scarce and expectations were crushing. That child would have been nothing like Jamie and Grace, who grew up surrounded by laughter and honest emotion, who were encouraged to be curious and bold. In 1880, when Jamie was 6 and Grace was 1, a telegram arrived at the ranch. It had been forwarded from the general store in El Paso, and it bore Philadelphia postmarks. Helena held it unopened for a full day, debating whether she wanted to know what it contained. Finally, Matthew gently took it from her hands and opened it himself. "Your father died," he said quietly, scanning the brief message. "Your mother wanted you to know, though she does not request your return or presence at the funeral." Helena sat down slowly, trying to process the information. She had not thought about her father in years, had successfully pushed him into the recesses of memory where painful things were stored and forgotten. Now he was gone, and she felt nothing but a sort of hollow relief. "I should feel sad," she said slowly. "He was my father, and now he is dead. But all I can think is that he cannot hurt me anymore, cannot send men to drag me back or threaten Matthew or try to take my children." "You do not owe him grief," Matthew said, kneeling before her chair. "He did not earn it through his treatment of you. You are allowed to feel however you feel, Helena. Relief, anger, sadness, nothing at all. There is no correct response." Helena looked at her husband, this man who had spent 7 years proving that love could be gentle and generous. "I feel grateful," she said finally. "Grateful that he failed to control me, grateful that I escaped before his choices destroyed me. And I feel sorry for my mother, who will spend the rest of her life in that cold house with nothing but her sense of propriety to keep her warm." She sent no telegram in response, no acknowledgement of the news. Philadelphia and everyone in it belonged to a different life, a different person. She was Helena Irving now, a rancher's wife and mother, a woman who could shoot a rifle and train a horse and balance account books. She was the woman who had chosen love when given the chance, and she had built something beautiful from that choice. The years rolled on in a pattern that became comfortably familiar. The ranch continued to thrive, weathering economic downturns and natural challenges through hard work and careful management. Jamie grew into a responsible young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, already showing talent with horses and cattle. Grace developed a quiet strength and sharp intelligence, surprising everyone by asking for books on mathematics and science when other girls her age wanted dolls and dresses. Matthew's hair began to show gray at the temples, and Helena found lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent smiling in the Texas sun. They were no longer the desperate young people who had married in a hotel room to escape pursuing investigators. They were partners who had built a life brick by brick, who knew each other's moods and habits, who could communicate with a glance across a crowded room. On their 10th anniversary, Matthew took Helena back to El Paso, to the train station where they had first met. They stood on the platform watching passengers disembark, and Helena marveled at how young and lost she had been that day, how terrified and brave at the same time. "You ever regret it?" Matthew asked, his hand warm in hers. "Running away, giving up your family and your inheritance and everything you knew?" Helena looked up at her husband, at the face she loved more with each passing year. "Not for a single moment," she said honestly. "I gave up nothing that mattered and gained everything that does. You, the children, the ranch, the life we have built together. I would make the same choice every time. Even knowing how hard it would be," Matthew pressed. "The work, the challenges, the struggles we have faced. Especially knowing that," Helena said firmly. "Because the struggles are what make the good parts meaningful. I do not want an easy life handed to me by someone else's decisions. I want this life, the one we chose together, the one where I get to be your partner instead of someone's possession." Matthew kissed her there on the platform, in front of curious strangers and the ghosts of who they had been a decade before. "Choose love this time," he murmured against her lips, echoing the words he had spoken in that desperate moment when she needed saving. "You did, and you changed my entire world." "We changed each other's worlds," Helena corrected, pulling him close. "And I would do it again in a heartbeat." They returned to the ranch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jamie and Grace ran out to meet them, excited to share stories about the foal that had been born while they were gone and the raccoon that Thomas had discovered in the barn. Helena listened to her children's voices overlapping in their enthusiasm, felt Matthew's arm around her waist, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The years continued to unfold in their predictable unpredictability. Jamie turned 16 and began courting a girl from town, a rancher's daughter with a quick laugh and kind eyes. Grace announced her intention to become a teacher, devouring books on education and pedagogy with the same intensity she brought to everything she cared about. The ranch added more horses, built new fences, weathered droughts, and celebrated good years. Matthew remained her anchor through all of it, steady and strong and utterly devoted. He brought her coffee every morning, still warm from the stove. He rubbed her feet in the evenings when she was tired from a long day of work. He made love to her with the same careful passion he had shown on their delayed wedding night, proving repeatedly that intimacy could be joyful rather than frightening. He was her best friend and her partner, her lover and her confidant, and she fell in love with him a little more deeply with each passing year. On their 20th anniversary, their children threw them a party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from across the territory. People came from El Paso and beyond, bringing food and gifts and stories about the Irvings who had built such a successful operation through hard work and integrity. Aaron and Thomas gave speeches that made everyone laugh, talking about Matthew's obsessive protectiveness when Helena first arrived, and how obvious it had been to everyone that he was hopelessly smitten. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, pulled Helena aside during the party. "I knew," she said, her blue eyes twinkling. "The moment Matthew sent you to my boarding house, I knew he had found someone special. You were running from your past and he was waiting for his future. It was just a matter of time before you both figured out you were exactly what the other needed." "Thank you for taking me in," Helena said, hugging the older woman carefully. "For not asking questions and for making me feel safe when I was terrified. Thank you for proving that sometimes running away is the bravest thing a person can do," Mrs. Patterson replied. "You showed a lot of young women in this town that they do not have to accept what other people choose for them. That courage matters more than respectability." As the party wound down and their guests departed, Helena stood on the porch with Matthew watching the sun set over land they had worked together for 2 decades. Jamie was inside cleaning up with his girl, their voices carrying through the open windows. Grace was reading on the porch swing, her book angled to catch the last of the daylight. 20 years, Matthew said, his arm around Helena's shoulders. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you stepped off that train. Other times it feels like you have always been here, like the ranch was incomplete before you arrived." "We were both incomplete," Helena said, leaning into his warmth. "You helped me figure out who I was beneath all the expectations and fear. You taught me what love looks like when it is honest and free." "You did the same for me," Matthew said quietly. "Before you, I thought I knew what my life would be. The ranch, the horses, eventually maybe a wife to help manage the household. But I did not understand what it meant to have a true partner, someone who challenged me and supported me in equal measure. Someone who saw me as more than just a rancher, who made me want to be better than I thought I could be." Helena turned to face him fully, her hands finding his face weathered from 20 years of Texas sun and hard work. "Do you remember what you said to me that day at the general store? When those men came looking for me?" "I said a lot of things," Matthew replied, his whiskey eyes soft with memory. "You told me to choose love," Helena said. "And I did. I chose you, chose this life, chose to believe that running toward something good was better than staying trapped in something terrible. It was the best choice I ever made, and I have never once regretted it." Matthew kissed her as the last light faded from the sky, and Helena thought about the woman she had been at 22, climbing through a window in her wedding dress because she could not face a future with a man she despised. That woman had been brave and terrified, desperate and determined, with no guarantee that her gamble would pay off. She had stepped onto a train heading west with nothing but hope and stolen money, not knowing if she would find safety or disaster. She had found Matthew instead. She had found home. Their life together continued to unfold in the years that followed, marked by the usual joys and sorrows that accompany any long partnership. Jamie married his girl and built a house on the northern section of the ranch, bringing the next generation of Irvings into the world. Grace left for college back east despite her father's concerns, determined to get her teaching degree and bring modern educational ideas back to Texas. She wrote long letters home describing her studies, and Helena read them aloud to Matthew in the evenings, both of them proud beyond measure of their fearless daughter. Matthew's brothers remained close. their families gathering for holidays and helping each other through the inevitable challenges of ranch life. Aaron lost his wife to influenza when she was only 45, and the whole family rallied around him, proving that chosen bonds could be just as strong as blood ties. Thomas's children grew up running wild across the ranch, as comfortable on horseback as on foot, carrying on the Irving tradition of raising the finest horses in West Texas. Helena never returned to Philadelphia, never reconciled with the family who had disowned her for choosing her own path. Her mother died in 1892, and a lawyer sent notification along with papers showing that Helena had been permanently removed from the will years before. Helena felt nothing but relief, confirmation that she had made the right choice in walking away from people who valued obedience over happiness. She and Matthew grew old together on the ranch they had built, watching their children and grandchildren carry on the work they had started. Matthew's hair went completely gray, and his hands developed arthritis that made some tasks difficult. But he still rose early each morning to check on the horses and walk the land he loved. Helena's auburn hair faded to silver, and her body softened with age, but her mind remained sharp and her spirit undimmed. On a warm evening in spring of 1903, they sat together on the porch watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard. Jamie's oldest son had a daughter now, a tiny girl with Helena's green eyes who toddled through the grass chasing butterflies. 30 years had passed since Helena stepped off that train in El Paso, and the ranch had grown from a modest horse operation to one of the most respected in Texas. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had stayed?" Matthew asked, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of decades together. "If you had married that man your father chose," Helena considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I think about the woman I would have become in that life. Bitter and small, probably, worn down by years of pretending to be satisfied with an existence that felt like suffocation. I think about the children I might have had, raised to value propriety over passion. And then I look at our life, at what we built together, and I cannot imagine any other path." "I think about it too," Matthew said quietly, "about how easily I could have missed you. If you had chosen a different town, if I had not been at the station that day, if I had not been brave enough to approach you, my whole life would have been different, emptier. But you were there," Helena said, squeezing his hand gently. "You saw a terrified woman in an expensive dress who clearly did not belong, and instead of walking past you stopped to help. You offered me kindness without expecting anything in return, and you taught me what love could be." "You taught me the same thing," Matthew replied. "I thought I understood love before you arrived. I loved my family, my brothers, this ranch, but what I felt for you was different, bigger somehow. You made me want to be the kind of man who deserved your trust and your affection. You challenged me to think beyond the boundaries of the life I had always known." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that only Texas seemed to manage. Their great-granddaughter squealed with delight as she caught a butterfly, her small hands gentle as she examined it before letting it go. Helena watched her and thought about cycles and generations, about the children and grandchildren who existed because she had been brave enough to run. "Choose love this time," Matthew murmured, echoing the words he had spoken 3 decades before in a moment of crisis and possibility. "Best advice I ever gave. Best advice I ever took," Helena replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. They were both 70 now, their bodies marked by years of hard work and Texas sun. But their love was as strong as it had been in that hotel room where a circuit preacher married them in haste to save her from the life she had fled. Matthew Irving had proposed to her when she was at her most desperate and frightened, offering marriage not as a trap but as freedom. He had told her to choose love, and she had chosen him. Together they had built something lasting and true, a partnership that had weathered every storm and celebrated every joy. As stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Helena thought about the train that had carried her west toward an unknown future. She thought about stepping onto that platform with nothing but fear and determination, about Matthew's whiskey eyes and easy confidence, about the decision that had changed the course of her entire life. She had run from an arranged marriage and found true love instead. She had escaped a prison of respectability and built a home of honest emotion and hard work. She had been brave enough to choose her own path, and that choice had given her 30 years of partnership with a man who saw her as an equal, who valued her strength and supported her dreams. Their children and grandchildren would carry on the Irving name, would work this land and raise their families here. And they would do so knowing that their grandmother had been brave enough to run toward love when the world told her to stay trapped in duty. That legacy mattered more to Helena than any inheritance her father could have left her, more than the social standing and financial security she had abandoned. She had chosen love that time, and every day since. She had chosen Matthew Irving, this honest cowboy who had offered her freedom and partnership and devotion without limits. And he had chosen her right back, seeing past the expensive dress and Philadelphia manners to the woman underneath who was desperate to be seen and valued for who she really was. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, their hands clasped and their bodies leaning into each other with the ease of long familiarity, Helena knew with absolute certainty that she would make the same choice again. Every time, in every circumstance, she would climb through that window and board that train and step onto that platform where Matthew Irving waited to change her life. She would choose love every single time,